1:52 a.m., Camp Arifjan in Kuwait's southern desert was operating at the tempo that American logistics installations sustain around the clock in active combat theaters. The continuous, unglamorous work of moving fuel, ammunition, food, repair parts, and personnel through the supply chain that keeps a deployed force alive. The installation was the largest American Army logistics facility in the Middle East, covering more than 8 square miles of hardened warehouses, vehicle parks, maintenance facilities, ammunition holding areas, and command infrastructure. It served as the primary Army pre-positioning site for the theater, the hub through which materiel moved from strategic sealift vessels at the port of Shuaiba to the forward positions across Iraq and Syria and the maritime logistics chain supplying the Gulf Fleet. 4,200 American service members and an additional 3,000 civilian contractors lived and worked in the compound's residential areas, hardened facilities, and operational buildings. It was not a glamorous installation. Logistics installations never are. It was one of the most strategically essential fixed military assets in the theater, and the IRGC had been trying to figure out how to seriously damage it since the first week of Operation Epic Fury. The problem was range and defense. Camp Arifjan sat at the southern end of Kuwait, 180 miles from the nearest IRGC launch complex in Khuzestan province. 180 miles was inside the effective range of the Zulfiqar ballistic missile and at the edge of the Fateh 313's optimal accuracy envelope. The Patriot PAC-3 batteries covering the Kuwaiti capital and the southern military installations had been at full operational readiness for the entire duration of the conflict. The air defense architecture over Kuwait was not as dense as the architecture over the Al Udeid or Jafar compounds, but it was substantial. 3 Patriot batteries, 2 THAAD batteries provided by South Korea's own defensive contribution to the coalition, and the naval aegis coverage from the USS Monterey and USS Vicksburg operating in the northern Gulf. Attacking Camp Arifjan with the IRGC's standard medium-range ballistic missiles against this defense would produce the result that every previous IRGC strike against defended American positions had produced: high intercept rates, limited physical damage, significant expenditure of irreplaceable weapons inventory. The IRGC's planners had spent 4 weeks after the conflict began developing an approach that could defeat the Kuwaiti defense architecture's specific configuration. The architecture had 2 characteristics they had assessed as exploitable. The first was its orientation. The Patriot and THAAD batteries covering Arifjan had been positioned to address the most likely threat azimuths, the northeast, the east, and the southeast, corresponding to the IRGC launch complexes in Khuzestan and Fars provinces. The battery's engagement geometry was optimized for these azimuths. A strike approaching from a different azimuth, from the northwest, from the direction of the Iraqi border, from a launch position in western Iraq rather than Iran itself, would face less favorable defensive geometry and potentially a reduced intercept probability at the engagement boundaries between battery coverage arcs. The second characteristic was magazine depth. After 4 weeks of active combat operations, every Patriot battery in the theater had expended a fraction of its initial interceptor load. Resupply was ongoing, but had not kept pace with expenditure at the operational tempo the conflict demanded. The IRGC's analysis of the intercept volume in published American engagement reports, which was final ikrar. The information that appeared in CENTCOM press releases in the track of battery activity that open-source analysts had been documenting, had produced an estimate of remaining PAC-3 MSE inventory in the Kuwait coverage area that, while imprecise, had been used to calculate the salvo size required to saturate the defense. The estimate was inaccurate in specific ways that the IRGC's planners could not have known from open-source analysis. The batteries had been resupplied more effectively than the open-source picture suggested. The magazine depth estimate was off by approximately 30%. The difference between the IRGC's assumed intercept capacity and the actual intercept capacity would prove decisive. The launch positions in western Iraq had been prepared over 17 days. Not by IRGC forces directly, the presence of uniformed IRGC personnel conducting missile launch preparations in Iraqi territory would have been detected and addressed with the same precision and speed that had destroyed every previous Iraqi territory launch infrastructure the IRGC had tried to establish. The preparation had been conducted by an Iraqi militia unit whose relationship to the IRGC Quds force was close enough that the tactical training and equipment transfer had occurred in Iran, with the militia commanders traveling to the Khuzestan launch complex infrastructure and spending 12 days learning the Zulfiqar and Fateh 313 launch sequences under IRGC Aerospace Force instruction. The militia had then returned to Iraq with 2 Zulfiqar and 4 Fateh 313 missiles, 6 mobile launcher vehicles, and the technical documentation and trained crews to employ them. They had staged the equipment at a series of agricultural sites in the Anbar Desert, west of the Euphrates, moving the vehicles between locations every 3 to 4 days, attempting to replicate the mobility doctrine that had kept the IRGC's own mobile launchers alive through 3 weeks of Air Force targeting. They had been moving, as the IRGC had calculated, faster than the American targeting cycle could decisively characterize. This calculation was approximately correct for the first 13 days. On the 14th day, a source within the militia's logistics chain had provided the intelligence fusion cell at Al-Udeid with the vehicle descriptions, the movement pattern, and the current staging location of all 6 launcher vehicles. The information had been assessed, cross-referenced against Space Force imagery that, now that analysts knew what vehicle types to look for, had produced 3 confirmatory sightings of the described vehicles at the described staging location. The targeting confidence had been assessed at 73%, not the 80+ threshold that would have authorized immediate engagement, but sufficient to justify positioning response assets and watching the staging area with elevated collection priority. On the 17th day, at 11 p.m., the staging area showed the first signs of pre-launch preparation, vehicles repositioning from their dispersed parking arrangement into the grouped formation that preceded a launch sequence. The thermal signatures of the launch vehicle's ground power units activating, the movement of personnel consistent with a crew bringing equipment to operational readiness. The targeting confidence updated to 87% at 11:44 p.m. The authorization was requested. The authorization was granted at 12:09 a.m. The response package began launching at 12:17 a.m., 95 minutes before the IRGC's militia launched its 6 missiles at Camp Arifjan. The 6 missiles launched at 1:52 a.m., 2 Zulfiqar and 4 Fateh 313, all from the Anbar Desert launch position, their trajectories approaching Arifjan from the northwest, as the IRGC's defense architecture analysis had prescribed. The Space Force infrared alert reached the Camp Arifjan Operations Center at 1:52 a.m. and 21 seconds. The protective posture protocol activated within 4 seconds. The base had been at elevated readiness since 12:09 a.m., since the authorization of the response package, which had included the alert notification to Arifjan's defensive systems as a simultaneous action to the launch authorization. The Patriot batteries had been in active emission since 12:14 a.m. The THAAD battery, positioned north of Kuwait City, acquired the 6 missiles at 1:57 a.m. as they reached the upper engagement envelope in their mid-course phase. The THAAD's geometry against an approach from the northwest was not its optimal configuration, exactly as the IRGC's planning had assessed. The battery fired against 4 of the 6 missiles in its manageable engagement arc, reserving the 2 on the edge of its coverage for the Patriot layer. 3 THAAD intercepts were confirmed between 1:57 a.m. and 1:59 a.m. in 30 seconds. One missile survived the THAAD engagement, a Zulfiqar whose approach trajectory had taken it through the seam between the THAAD battery's optimal arc and the Patriot battery's northern position. The Korean THAAD battery, the contribution of the Republic of Korea to the coalition's theater missile defense architecture, deployed 3 weeks into the conflict when Seoul had assessed that the IRGC's escalation trajectory warranted additional Allied commitment, was positioned southwest of Kuwait City to cover the gap in the primary THAAD's coverage arc. It had acquired 2 of the 6 missiles at 1:56 a.m. and had fired its first engagement at 1:57 a.m. and 40 seconds. Both engagements were confirmed. The Korean crews, operating equipment that was technically identical to the American THAAD battery and trained on the same procedures, had performed the same task with the same result. Coordination between the 2 THAAD batteries was managed through the Theater Missile Defense Common Operating Picture that treated the Korean system as a full participant in the engagement architecture. The engagement was seamless. The engagement was also the public validation that South Korea's decision to deploy its own THAAD assets in support of coalition operations had been operationally consequential. The Patriot batteries engaged the 3 missiles that THAAD had passed, and the one THAAD had missed at ranges appropriate to each threat's approach. PAC-3MSE and shoot-shoot doctrine against the 2 remaining Fateh 313 missiles, 2 PAC-3s each. 4 rounds. 2 intercepts confirmed. The seam-threading Zulfiqar was engaged by the Northern Patriot battery at a range of 22 miles, the minimum range at which the engagement geometry was acceptable. Both PAC-3s fired. The first missed. The second hit. The Zulfiqar was destroyed at 11 miles from the Camp Arifjan perimeter. The warhead debris fell in uninhabited desert 3 miles short of the base's outer fence. One Fateh 313 had not been assigned to the Patriot layer in the initial engagement sequencing. The 6th missile, the one on the approach azimuth that had been assessed as lowest priority in the initial track picture because its projected impact point was in the base's vehicle park area, rather than the higher value command or ammunition infrastructure. The sequencing decision had been made in 3 seconds of engagement management. The 6th Fateh 313 survived both the THAAD and Patriot layers and impacted Camp Arifjan at 2:01 a.m. and 44 seconds. The impact point was the southwestern edge of the main vehicle park, an area containing approximately 90 tactical wheeled vehicles at various states of maintenance and readiness. The Fateh 313 warhead detonated on contact with the hardstand surface. The blast and fragmentation pattern destroyed or severely damaged 14 vehicles within the lethal radius. 31 additional vehicles sustained varying degrees of fragment damage. No personnel were in the vehicle park. The protective posture protocol had moved all personnel in open areas to hardened shelter at 1:52 a.m. and 25 seconds. The vehicle damage was assessed as significant in raw numbers and marginal in operational impact. 14 vehicles destroyed out of a pre-positioning fleet of several thousand represented a loss well within normal maintenance and attrition parameters. The vehicle park was back in operation within 4 hours. The damaged vehicles moved to assessment areas and the remaining vehicles reorganized. The ammunition holding areas, the command infrastructure, the fuel storage complex, the port liaison facilities, and the Strategic Logistics Coordination Center that made Camp Arifjan operationally significant were all undamaged. None of them had been in the Fateh 313's impact zone. 5 of 6 missiles intercepted. 1 impact. 14 vehicles destroyed. Camp Arifjan continued operations without interruption. The strategic logistics function that had been the IRGC's target, the supply chain sustaining American forces across the theater, had not been disrupted for a minute. The response was designated Operation ANVIL STRIKE. The intelligence package that had been built over 17 days against the Anbar launcher position was comprehensive. The response package was not designed only to address the launch position itself. The vehicles had already fired their missiles and were in the process of their post-launch displacement sequence, which the Space Force constellation had begun tracking at 1:53 a.m., 1 minute after the launches. The response package was designed to address the entire IRGC Khuzestan launch infrastructure that had trained the militia, supplied the missiles, and provided the operational planning for the Arifjan strike. 3 weeks of epic fury had addressed Khuzestan's most visible fixed infrastructure. What remained, the dispersed mobile launcher parks, the satellite training facilities, the command nodes that coordinated the Western Iraq militia operations, and the hardened propellant storage that sustained the Fateh and Zulfiqar production cycle, had been the subject of a targeting development program that the Night Watch Operations Cell had been running for 19 days, waiting for the intelligence picture to reach sufficient confidence across all aim points simultaneously. The Arifjan strike had provided the triggering condition and the final location data for the mobile assets. The Anbar launcher vehicles were the first targets. They had been tracked on their displacement routes since 1:53 a.m. The 2 Zulfiqar launcher vehicles and 4 Fateh 313 launcher vehicles had separated after launch, following the IRGC's dispersal doctrine that sent each vehicle in a different direction to prevent a single strike from addressing all of them. The Space Force constellation tracked all 6 simultaneously. The F-35As assigned to the Anbar target set had been airborne since 12:17 a.m. and had been holding in a patrol orbit over the Syrian-Iraqi border at the authorization of Engagement Authority for the Western Iraq launcher position. They received the post-launch track data at 1:53 a.m. and began their intercepts. The 6 vehicles were engaged between 2:07 a.m. and 2:19 a.m. by GBU-39 small-diameter bombs. Each vehicle struck at its current displacement position with coordinates updated from the Space Force constellation through the targeting data link. All 6 launcher vehicles were confirmed as total losses of asset. The Khuzestan infrastructure strikes were addressed by the B-1B Lancer package that had departed its forward operating location at midnight, 92 minutes before the Arifjan strike, launched on the authorization that had been granted at 12:09 a.m. and timed to arrive on target in the window following the missile launches, when the IRGC's response would be absorbed in managing the aftermath of the engagement. The B-1Bs carried JASSM-ER cruise missiles assigned to 17 aim points across the Khuzestan launch infrastructure, the forward assembly facility at Avaz, where Fateh 313 missiles had been prepared for the Western Iraq transfer, the 2 hardened propellant storage bunkers that held the Zulfiqar program's solid fuel reserves, the mobile launcher maintenance facility at Desful, where the vehicles used by the militia had been serviced before the Iraq deployment, and the command coordination complex at Masjid Soliman that had served as the IRGC Aerospace Forces coordination node for Western Iraq militia operations. The JASSM-ER salvo was released from the B-1Bs at 2:24 a.m., beginning their individual terrain-masked approach profiles toward the 17 Khuzestan aim points. The EA-18G Growlers that had been jamming the IRGC's communications network since 2:11 a.m. had suppressed the frequencies through which any surviving IRGC Aerospace Force personnel could have received warning of the inbound cruise missiles. The missiles arrived on target between 2:54 a.m. and 3:09 a.m. The Avaz assembly facility received 4 JASSM-ER impacts. The Desful maintenance facility received 3. The Masjid Soliman command complex received 2. The propellant storage bunkers received 1 JASSM-ER each, precision impacts on the ventilation shafts that the targeting analysis had identified as the penetration path that would allow the warhead's blast effect to propagate into the stored propellant. Both detonated in the expected sympathetic ignition pattern. The thermal signatures on Space Force infrared were the largest recorded in the Khuzestan theater since the first night of epic fury. The F-35A package addressed the 8 remaining aim points, the Fateh 313 reload storage sites that had been providing the missiles for the Western Iraq operation. These sites were not hardened facilities in the same sense as the Avaz assembly complex. They were concealed dispersal points, agricultural buildings, walled compounds, a construction equipment depot whose identification had been the product of the 17-day targeting development program and whose engagement with GBU-39 small-diameter bombs was conducted between 2:31 a.m. and 2:48 a.m. All 8 sites were struck. Secondary explosions at 4 of them indicated the presence of propellant or warhead components in the stored inventory. At 3:14 a.m., the post-strike preliminary assessment reached the ANVIL Strike Operations Cell. The Anbar launcher vehicles, all 6 confirmed as total losses of asset. The Khuzestan launch infrastructure, 17 aim points struck, all assessed as struck with damage consistent with operational neutralization. The propellant storage, 2 bunkers destroyed with sympathetic detonation confirmed. The IRGC Aerospace Forces Khuzestan-based Western Iraq operations support infrastructure, the capability that had planned, resourced, trained, and supplied the Arifjan strike, was assessed as comprehensively degraded, with reconstitution requiring resupply and reconstruction programs extending beyond the current operational timeline. Camp Arifjan's morning logistics cycle began at 5 a.m., as it did every morning. The vehicle park that had received the Fateh 313 impact was under assessment by the engineering team, its damaged vehicles documented and segregated, its operational vehicles redistributed to cover the reduced capacity. The supply manifests for the day's deliveries to forward positions in Iraq and Syria were being processed in the coordination center. The port liaison team was coordinating the morning's offload from the Shuaiba container terminal. The fuel distribution schedule was active. The ammunition allocation for the ongoing air campaign was being confirmed against available stocks and transport capacity. 4,200 American service members and 3,000 contractors were at work in the largest army logistics hub in the Middle East, sustaining the campaign that had been running for 4 weeks and would continue running for as long as the mission required. The base's public affairs officer, asked at the 6 a.m. command brief to characterize the operational impact of the Fateh 313 strike, used the word that the engineering team had used in their damage report: minimal. 14 vehicles destroyed or severely damaged out of a total fleet of several thousand. A vehicle park assessed as operational in 4 hours with the redistributed capacity of the undamaged vehicles. 0 disruption to any logistics function. 0 disruption to any personnel function. The protective posture protocol had been activated with sufficient warning time that no personnel had been exposed to the impact's effects. The base had absorbed the strike and had continued functioning with the uninterrupted efficiency of a logistics installation that had been built and staffed precisely to absorb this kind of operational stress and keep moving. The IRGC had spent 17 days positioning a missile force in Iraq, 12 days training a militia to use it, 6 weeks developing the targeting analysis that had led them to believe a northwest approach would defeat the Kuwait defense architecture, and a significant fraction of their remaining Zulfiqar and Fateh 313 inventory on an attack that had destroyed 14 vehicles. The infrastructure that had made the attack possible was burning in Khuzestan. The 6 launcher vehicles were wreckage in the Anbar desert. The Arifjan supply chain had not missed a delivery. In the mathematics of strategic logistics, the supply chain that continues to function under fire is not merely a logistics success. It is a strategic statement. The campaign needs ammunition. The ammunition is moving. The enemy's ability to stop it moving has been systematically removed. The rest is arithmetic.